Today's video is sponsored by NordVPN. Take control of the internet again. Even with all the odd events that we see in history, it's still hard to imagine two nations going to war over pastry. In the late 1830s, a Frenchman living in Mexico, known only as Remontel, sent a note to the French government and Emperor Louis-Philippe complaining that his pastry shop on the outskirts of Mexico City had been looted and that the Mexican government was refusing to pay damages. Little could this Remontel have known that he was throwing a spark that would become the fires of war, or that this short pastry war would have ramifications for Mexico for decades to come. It's history that deserves to be remembered. I want to thank the sponsor of today's episode, NordVPN, and right now they're offering a great deal where you can get 70% off a 3-year subscription plus an additional month free if you go to nordvpn.com/thehistoryguy, or just go to the NordVPN page and use the code thehistoryguy. That will make your subscription just $3.49 a month. So again, take control of the internet again. Go to nordvpn.com/thehistoryguy. You know, look, I have an internet business, and frankly, all of us today are doing more of our business online and buying more of our stuff online, and that's why you need the military-grade encryption of NordVPN. And not only will NordVPN prevent other people who want to see or intercept your data from getting it, but they don't collect the data themselves because, frankly, there's some history, like your browser history and your purchase history, that doesn't deserve to be remembered. Look, I'm not always the most tech-savvy guy, but NordVPN is really easy to use. You just install a browser extension on Chrome, and you're there in one click. It's got apps for Android or iOS, so they can use it on your devices, and if you get lost, they have 24/7 customer service. Also really useful, NordVPN has thousands of servers in more than 60 countries. You can essentially view the internet as if you're somewhere else in the world. So if you have an internet business like myself, you can view what's going on elsewhere. Let's say I want to see what's trending on YouTube in another part of the world. I can just click on a server there and boom, there you go. Or let's say you want to watch a show that's on Netflix, but it's not playing in the United States, like that Michael Jordan documentary, The Last Dance. It's playing in the UK, but not in the US. All you have to do is go click on the UK server, and there you go. Honestly, NordVPN is really cool. It's really easy to use. It's got so many features that I couldn't talk about them all here, but if you don't like it, they have a 30-day money-back guarantee. Take it from someone whose business is on the internet. NordVPN offers me the encryption that I need to feel safe with my data. And all you need to do to take control of the internet again is go to nordvpn.com/thehistoryguy and get that great deal, 70% off a 3-year subscription plus another month free. That is history that deserves to be remembered. Ever since Mexico achieved independence from Spain with the Treaty of Cordoba in 1821, the country had been plagued with violence and instability. Between 1824 and 1837, the country had more than 30 heads of state, variously elected presidents, appointed replacements, or leaders of coups. Because of the instability, there was almost no policing in the country, and the violence spilled over into businesses and private property. The first president elected after independence was Guadalupe Victoria, a leader in the War for Independence, who served from 1824 to 1829. His term was an anomaly. No other president would manage to finish his term for the next nearly 30 years. In the election of Victoria's successor in 1828, Secretary of War Manuel Gomez Pedraza won the election and was supported by Victoria. Under the Mexican Constitution of the time, the president was elected by state legislatures and not by popular vote. General Santa Anna, later of the Alamo fame, rebelled in support of the second-place Vicente Guerrero, a more radical general of the revolution whom supporters argued had more popular support. Called the Mutiny of La Acordada, Guerrero's supporters took over the Acordada, a prison-turned-armory in Mexico City, in November of 1828. Days of fighting racked the city, and Pedraza fled to England in exile, abandoning his claim to the presidency. Congress later appointed Guerrero to the seat that Pedraza had resigned, but for several months before he took office, anarchy reigned. On December 4th, a victorious crowd, 5,000 strong, rioted and converged on the Parian building in Mexico City's Central Square, which held a number of luxurious shops and was a core of trade. One Mexican governor described what was called the Parian Riot. Numerous insolent plebes forced open the doors of the Parian and then began sacking the building or bazaar, which for more than a century was the emporium of commerce and contained cash goods worth the enormous sum of 2.5 million pesos. The Parian Riot was simply one of the more egregious examples of the almost endemic violence in Mexico at the time, and when the foreign shop owners appealed to the Mexican government, they found that their complaints fell on deaf ears, a government that was either unable or unwilling to do anything for them. When, in 1838, the French government received Remontel's complaint detailing the looting of his pastry shop, it was just the last in a long and growing list of complaints from French nationals who were suffering in the unstable nation. The shop, supposedly valued at about 1,000 pesos, demanded the huge sum of 60,000 pesos in compensation. These were not the only sources of dispute between the two countries. A French national had been executed in 1837 for piracy. Don't all good stories involve pirates? And Mexico's trade with France was subject to higher taxes than trade with the U.S. and Great Britain. Possibly most importantly, France was angry over unpaid debts that Mexico had incurred during the Texas Revolution in 1835 and 36. But while this complaint over pastries was probably not the largest excuse for French intervention, it was reported widely in the French papers as the casus belli for the war, and thus gave the conflict its famous name. The French government officially demanded 600,000 pesos in compensation for various claims, the equivalent of 3 million francs. It was at the time an enormous sum of money. In 1837, a small French squadron, a frigate, and 3 brigs was sent to convince Mexico of their resolve. They anchored off Veracruz and blockaded the port essentially unopposed, capturing 36 merchantmen. By April 1838, diplomatic relations had completely broken down. The Mexican Congress refused to pay the sum, so France sent a new force to begin a blockade of important Mexican ports in the Gulf, from the Yucatan to the Rio Grande. The small force at Veracruz had been struck with yellow fever, so no attack on the city came until the fall of that year. The Second Fleet, under Admiral Charles Baudin, included 4 large frigates, 2 24-gun corvettes, 8 brigs, and 2 bomb ships. Baudin tried to negotiate with Mexico, now led by Anastasio Bustamante, but the Mexicans refused to budge. The blockade, while effective, was not debilitating, and Mexico hoped to hold out until the French had to resupply, as they were using the Spanish port of Havana as their base of operations. Finally, Baudin issued an ultimatum that he would attack the city's fort at noon on February 27th. As the French ships moved to battle order, the city sent 2 men out to negotiate, while a number of neutral ships anchored out of range to watch the impending battle. At 2 p.m. on November 27th, Baudin sent a message to the city. I have lost all hopes to obtain through pacific means the honorable settlement that I was in charge of proposing to the Mexican cabinet. I find myself in the necessity to open hostilities. A half hour later, the French fleet began their bombardment. The fortress was large and imposing, but armed with only 186 old and poorly maintained guns and a garrison of 800 poorly equipped and ill soldiers. The French attack was devastating. Baudin would later describe the battle, saying that never before had I seen a more nourished and well-directed fire. I had no other worry than to moderate its ardor. From time to time, I signaled a ceasefire to let the smoke that hid the fortress dissipate. We then corrected the pointing in fire and would begin again with a renewed vivacity. The defenders of the fort bravely returned fire, but they were unable to do much damage to the attacking fleet. 2 of the fort's powder magazines exploded, and shortly thereafter the fort's signal tower collapsed in an impressive mushroom cloud of debris. After a 4th explosion around 5 p.m., the return fire from the fort diminished significantly. At 8 p.m., Baudin called for a ceasefire, simply so that his own ships could conserve ammunition. Baudin and the Mexicans negotiated throughout the night. Baudin offered the fort honorable capitulation, but if they refused, he said it would annihilate the fortress. The fort was in fact in dire straits. The upper battery was completely destroyed. 200 men had already been killed or injured, and much of the fort's ammunition had been destroyed. The Mexican general finally surrendered when Baudin threatened to bombard the city. The powerful fort had been bombarded to submission in a single afternoon by a relatively light squadron of ships. The victory actually stunned foreign observers, including men aboard the U.S. revenue cutter Woodbury at port after an accidental collision with a French ship. The French casualties were only 4 dead and 29 wounded. 3 artillery companies and French infantry occupied the fort, but allowed around 1,000 Mexican soldiers to remain inside the city. Mexican authorities were shocked by the capture of the fort, which they thought to be almost invincible. They declared war on France and sent 3,200 soldiers under General Santa Anna and General Murillo Arista. Santa Anna had been near Veracruz at the time of the attack, where he had been living in retirement on a ranch. His reputation had been ruined by his failure during the war with Texas, but he offered his services again to the government upon sighting the city, and they accepted. The army arrived in Veracruz quickly, frustrating Baudin, who had thought the attack would lead to renewed negotiations. Veracruz was defended by a ring of fortifications, along with the Mexican army, but the French knew the small city well. He planned a raid on the city with the goal of surprising the army and capturing Santa Anna. In the early morning of December 5th, around 1,500 Frenchmen landed, the infantry reinforced with sailors from the ships. 2 columns climbed the city wall and took the Mexican defenders completely by surprise, capturing them without a shot fired. The soldiers hurried to follow the walls to the city's far side. A 3rd column attacked the door to the port and was tasked with assaulting the buildings where the generals were staying. They blew the door and reached the building almost unstopped, but Mexican defenders began putting up resistance. The French captured General Arista, but Santa Anna was able to escape. Boudin, who disembarked, ordered his men back aboard the boats. The first 2 columns retreated successfully, but while the 3rd was being loaded, Santa Anna commanded a counterattack. The French used carronades on the boats and captured artillery to repel the attack. The Mexican force was badly bloodied in the attack, and Santa Anna's horse was killed and his leg badly wounded, and have to be amputated shortly thereafter. 8 Frenchmen were killed and 56 wounded, many of them by friendly fire in the chaos of the counterattack, while Santa Anna says she lost 31 killed and another 26 wounded. The attack did finally convince the Mexican government to return to the negotiations. The British offered their services as mediators, and Ambassador Robert Pagnam was dispatched to assist. The French did not change their demands as their position grew stronger, and ultimately Mexico promised to pay the 600,000 pesos, as well as a promise of trade commitments in place of indemnities for the war. The treaty was signed on March 9th, 1839, and the French forces withdrew. Thus, the short Pastry War, lasting only 3 months, came to an end. While the Pastry War was brief, it had a surprisingly large impact on Mexican history. One of the things it did was rehabilitate the reputation of the infamous general Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who then again seized the presidency in March of 1839. His dictatorial and incompetent rule, along with the sorry state of the Mexican economy, led to more instability, revolution, and violence. The impact on the Mexican economy and military was disproportionately large for such a brief conflict. That left Mexico in a much reduced position just 10 years before they would again be at war, this time with the United States. The Mexican loss in that conflict had a profound impact on the future of both nations and the relationship between the two. But the brief Pastry War set a precedent for more French intervention in Mexico. The 600,000 pesos was never paid, and that became a significant part of the complaints that eventually led to the much more devastating 5.5-year-long second French intervention in Mexico, which had the French briefly installing an Austro-Hungarian duke as Emperor of Mexico. While there were many causes of the instability in the Mexican Republic following independence from Spain, it was in many ways the Pastry War that facilitated nearly a century of instability and foreign intervention that really didn't subside until the end of the Mexican Revolution in 1920. All because of a complaint over some stolen pastries.